Good evening, everybody. My name is Amanda Holmes. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of Lissa Muscatine and Bradley Graham, the owners of the store, and all the booksellers here, welcome to this evening's event. Before we get started, can I ask you to silence your cell phones? When we get to the question and answer portion of the event, we have two microphones, one over here and one over here next to the pillar. Since we're audio recording, if you have a question, could you please step up to one of the microphones when we get to that part of the event. And also at the end of the event, it would help us a lot in putting the store back together if you could fold up your chairs and prop them against a bookcase or pillar nearby. Okay, so this evening it's my pleasure to introduce Anne Nelson, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of many books. She teaches at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and has been the recipient of numerous awards and grants, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Livingston Award for International Reporting. Her new book, Shadow Network, Media Money and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, is a meticulously researched and deeply unsettling read. It tells the 4-decade story of the Council for National Policy, which counts among its members Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon, Betsy DeVos, and the Koch brothers. By flooding the airwaves with right-wing propaganda in key swing states and paying selected schools to promote its libertarian agenda, the Council for National Policy has grown in power and influence, in spite of majority public opinion and the popular vote, and it was a key player in the 2016 presidential election and in the shaping of public policy. Please join me in welcoming Anne Nelson to Politics and Prose.
A couple of minor corrections to the introduction. There's a little rotation that happens in the Council for National Policy. So recent indications are that Kellyanne Conway is not currently a member, but she's in close touch with members. Betsy DeVos is not a member, but her mother, her father, her father-in-law, her husband, and her brother have been, so I call her the Crown Princess. This story in some ways began in 2004. I was in my home state of Oklahoma driving to Walmart, which is what you do in Oklahoma, and I had the radio on. And I heard a local, I thought, preacher talking to somebody about marriage equality, except they called it something else. And what he was telling his call-in listener was that if John Kerry from the sinful state of Massachusetts was elected president, then you might have marriage equality happening, in which case the sanctity of her marriage would be threatened. And the woman was very disturbed. She said, well, I've been married to my husband for 40 years. You mean my marriage won't be sanctified in the same way? And he said, no, it won't. I'm sorry, you must prevent this at all costs. And I thought, that's not right. So I tucked it away in my mind. I have an old friend here from my reporting days in the Caribbean who, you know, we used to talk about reporting as gathering bits of string and then waiting until they added up to something. And so I tucked it away. Fast forward to 2016, November 8th, I'm watching television and the election returns, and I'm watching the New York Times election meter go from 95% certainty for Hillary Clinton's victory down to 60, 40, 10, 5. And I said to myself, how did everyone get it so wrong? All of these smart people in the news media, all of these pollsters, all of these people who were predicting a done deal, regardless of what you thought the right outcome was, something happened here that was not predictable. So I went back to the question of these radio stations. And what I found was a station that I had heard in Oklahoma was actually one station among several networks that had hundreds of radio stations in their networks. They were fundamentalist, but they were also openly and overtly political. And they were tying the two together in ways that seemed odd to me in light of IRS regulations governing tax-exempt entities that are not supposed to be involved in partisan politics, including churches. So as I went along gathering my bits of string, I found that many of the principles in this picture belong to something called the Council for National Policy. What an anodyne title. What does that mean? And it's almost the kind of title, I mean, I had to kind of rehearse it for several months before I could even remember it. But then I found, as I conducted the research, that this organization had a long history that started to influence our national life in ways that have been barely perceptible to those of us who are living on the East and the West Coasts. It had its roots in the backlash to integration in the South. There were a number of people who were largely from the Southern Baptist Convention, but there were other denominations as well, where they wanted to maintain their schools, which were also profit centers, as segregated institutions that protected their populations from integration, but at the same time maintain their tax-exempt status. And that was becoming increasingly difficult under federal law. And as well, the Southern Baptist Convention had been liberalizing. Like the other denominations, they had more open attitudes towards issues like abortion, certainly integration, and so on. And several people inside the denomination intensely objected to this. So they organized a kind of gradual internal coup that entailed purging the moderates from positions of influence within the church and installing people who had more hardline attitudes and who could work as kind of a cohort to gradually take it over and push back some of the church positions that had been liberalizing in the recent past. This was happening over the late 60s into the 70s, and in 1980, a very compelling moment occurred. Ronald Reagan came to the Freedom Rally in Dallas, and hundreds and hundreds of pastors and co-religionists came along, and a kind of bargain was struck. Now, remember, Ronald Reagan was not a fundamentalist. He was a Hollywood figure who drank, he made cigarette advertisements, and he had an eye for the ladies. But for that day in Dallas, he became a true believer, and he told everyone that his favorite book was the Bible, and that he endorsed their role in politics. And they tacitly endorsed him. They got behind the Southern strategy and pushed. And in 1981, the year following Reagan's election, they organized something called the Council for National Policy. It had its home base initially in McLean, Virginia, not so very far from here. Who made it up? Well, there were fundamentalist pastors, including people who had reached national prominence through broadcasting, and that became a real power base of evangelical and fundamentalist religious organizations over that period. Jerry Falwell was one figure, Pat Robertson, others that you might recognize. So they made one cohort, and they had their interests, and they had their levers of power. A second area were people from the extractive industries, especially from the oil industry in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And if you combine that with Kansas, you almost find that you have a political and economic unit that has exerted a powerful economic influence on our lives and on the U.S. economy. And they had a vested interest, which was to thwart environmental regulations that cut into their profits. And environmentalism was a growing concern at that time. And every time there were fines or lawsuits, that cut into their profits, and they meant to push back. So here, the fundamentalists and the extractive industries had a common enemy, which was the federal government. They saw the federal courts as shoving social issues down the throats of people who lived in other parts of the country. The extractive industries saw the federal regulators as biting into their profits and limiting their activities. You then had a third sector, and this is a fascinating group. It was the political operatives. One of them was Richard Viguerie, who was the father of direct mail marketing. He had come out of the Goldwater campaign with other young operatives, and he was also a creature of the region. He was a Cajun from Texas, And he had been affiliated both with televangelists in Tulsa and with people from the extractive industries. And he had a very keen sense of how to locate and motivate hidden pockets of voters. So 1981, they all come together and found this organization. One of their early activities was to support right-wing movements in Central America. I happened to be a reporter in El Salvador at the time. There was a man named Roberto Dabuison who was heavily involved in death squad activity and implicated in the assassination of Archbishop Romero. They invited him to Washington and feted him, and one of the young Republicans present told the press that he thought that the press had given death squads a bad reputation. So these were the early days. Later on, they tried to exert their political influence towards certain Republican candidates. They were often disappointed because that was still a period where you had Republican moderates in positions of influence in Congress and in the administrations. So they would go to someone like George H.S. Bush and say, all right, we're ready to support you. We need you to buy into our movement. Well, George H.S. Bush was a cradle Episcopalian. He'd never done the immersion thing. And he was willing to humor them, but then once he came into office, he again would appoint moderates to his cabinet and make deals with Democrats and conduct all kinds of activities that were not well received. So they kept looking for people who would fulfill their end of the bargain. And if they couldn't make a deal with them, they would try to cultivate them. In 2008, they identified a young Indiana politician named Mike Pence, and they started to work with him. He had had a conversion experience from Catholic to Evangelical, and they started inviting him to their meetings. He started appearing at their lunches to brief them on goings-on on the Hill, and over time they started gradually promoting him and elevating him in the political hierarchy as someone that they wanted to keep in reserve for the future. In the meantime, Obama won. This was a shock. This was a dreadful shock, actually. Obama really, in many ways, represented their worst nightmare, both in terms of his identity and his policies, environmentalism, et cetera, but also in his tactics, because he had brought in a team of smart young technologists, and he used social media in a way that had never been seen before. Facebook analytics, et cetera, et cetera. And through these methods, his team activated blocks of voters that had not been reached before. They had phone trees that responded to data collected through social media. And it came as a shock, especially since his Republican opponent really hadn't focused on the internet, social media, or the whole digital transformation of society. So at this point, the environmental regulations were stepped up, and there was a new level of contest that was undertaken. Now, the Koch brothers had already had relationships with people connected to the Council for National Policy. One of the major economic forces in the Council for National Policy was the DeVos family of Michigan, building on the billions of dollars they'd made with their Amway fortune. And you see, if you do, as I did, going through many, many years of FEC filings and other records online, that there's a kind of round robin of financing that happens, where the DeVosses fund the Koch brothers projects and the Koch brothers fund the DeVos family projects, and then you throw in some other figures like Foster Friess. There's a network of funding that finances a network of organizations and also connects to another huge dimension of the story, which is the media chunk. Now that starts with my radio networks in these southern and swing states, where you have something like 500 radio stations that are owned by members of the Council for National Policy. One of them distributes content to over 2,000 more. We're talking about states where people spend a lot of time in the car. And a lot of the voters who are mobilized in these situations are older voters. They're not listening to NPR podcasts. They're turning the radio on, and the local radio stations would be increasingly these fundamentalist stations, these right-wing talk radio stations. And at the same time, over this period of history, we're talking about the last 20 years, you have what I call a colony collapse of the local newspapers. They are dying off in middle America by the hundreds. And you lose not only the newspapers, you lose the culture of these newspapers. Because, yes, you have local reporters, and they go to the high school basketball games. They also have front pages that carry AP stories, Associated Press. So you have this kind of distribution system of news throughout the country where people can speak from the same concept of the facts of what's really happening. You lose the newspaper, you lose the circulatory system, because that means that the wire service content doesn't come to the local newspapers. The newspapers' reporters don't feed back to the home office for that redistribution process that we had for much of the 20th century. At the same time, you have a collapse of the audience for network news. The numbers go down drastically over the last 30 years. So whereas when I was growing up in Oklahoma, we got the newspaper, we got a news magazine, and we had Walter Cronkite on during the dinner hour, that news culture has gone away. And it's left a vacuum in many parts of America that these organizations are all too eager to fill. Now, the radio stations do not operate in isolation. There are also several very large, very significant evangelical television broadcast networks, CBN and TBN among them, who can account for over 100 million people in their audience. So if you look at where they're distributed and where there's an absence of other sources of professional journalism, and then you add on top of that the effect of Fox News on cable and Sinclair in local stations, you basically have a parallel news culture where Americans are talking past each other. We're not even on the same page in terms of what the facts are, much less how to agree on them. And so when people say, how could they possibly vote like that? They're saying that same thing about you. So that is what I was documenting with as much research as I could assemble. And the picture becomes fairly clear. And in fact, in the book, there's an overlay of a map that shows what we call the news deserts in America, where a county might not even have one functioning daily newspaper. And over the same states, you have an overlay of maybe 3 of these fundamentalist radio networks. And I have spent hours and hours listening to their broadcasts, so you don't have to. And what I have heard have been things such as, quote, Hillary Clinton is a demon. Beto O'Rourke is the son of Satan. The Democrats like to have gun violence because they exploit it with their hearings. And most recently, the Democrats are in favor of executing babies on the day of their birth. They call it birthday abortions, but they do use the term execute. So I've actually been to a living room in Oklahoma where I've had a perfectly reasonable woman turn to me and say, why do Democrats like to execute babies? Why would anyone vote for a Democrat under these circumstances? When the Koch brothers enter the picture, they are also very concerned about the economic consequences of Barack Obama's administration. It is not going well for them. They're getting penalties, they're getting fines, they have toxic waste dumps, they have something called a cancer alley in Louisiana, and they're being held to account. So what they do is invest $50 million in a state-of-the-art data platform called i360. And this assembles data in ways that has actually not happened before in political campaign culture. It eventually extends to well over 200 million Americans. And it expands the universe of data, working with a company called Cambridge Analytica. And what it does is mines data from commercial sites like Netflix and Amazon, as well as voter data, what party is registered. It accesses very incredible universes of data, banking data, health data. And all of a sudden you start to get a tipping of the advantage in terms of how political data is used in campaigns. It reaches the point where they manage to integrate the data into campaigns that use apps that are connected to door-to-door canvassing on the part of partner organizations. Now, it so happens that the membership of the Council for National Policy includes the heads of the National Rifle Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to social benefits, the Susan B. Anthony list, which is anti-abortion, the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, and Tea Party Patriots. So these organizations all can interact, and many of them apply to the same data platform and have the same app template that was pioneered for the Brexit campaign in the UK. And it worked pretty well there. And so it was brought over for its next stage, which was as the Cruise Crew app for Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz was a very apt candidate for pioneering this project. His mother was a computer scientist. His father was a pro-Castro revolutionary as a young mathematician, and then he came to North America and became a fundamentalist pastor. So Ted Cruz had every element of this in his heritage. And the Cruise Crew app was very interesting. It networked in a group of pastors who were also connected to the organization. And pastors were encouraged and even pressured and even bullied to make their church directories available to the movement for downloading. And then the strategists from this organization went through the church directories and other sources of names and affiliations, and they could identify by comparing the data through different sources which people in an organization were likely to vote in their direction and which ones weren't. And the idea was to activate the voters that they could count on. So their strategists said that they had identified 18 million evangelical voters who were not engaged, some of them not registered, and that they would target them through all of these means: social pressure, social media, organizations. They developed a digital function called geofencing that was used widely by the National Rifle Association and others. And they applied it, and I think that Ted Cruz had some deficits as a candidate, and the digital campaigns helped him overcome some of them. But then they faced a crisis because he did not win the primaries. And in May 2016, they reached a point of crisis. Cruz had to bow out of the campaign. He went public and called Donald Trump a pathological liar, and worse. But the movement faced a dilemma, because if they didn't go with Trump, that left them with Hillary Clinton. Now, many of them, including their religious leadership, had been on record saying never Trump. One of their Southern Baptist figures had said, out of a list of 17, Trump is number 17. Actually, he doesn't even make the list, right? But this gave them this moment of pause. And so they arranged an event. They called a gathering of about 1,000 fundamentalist leaders on June 21st, 2016 at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Times Square, New York City, otherwise known as Sodom and Gomorrah. And they gathered them and presented Trump to their brethren and sisters. And Trump, in a kind of strange echo of Reagan in 1980, spoke the correct words. He talked the talk of the fundamentalists. Now, he had not been a fundamentalist himself. He had not particularly been a regular churchgoer. He'd been a Presbyterian. But the gathering had no, nothing against Presbyterians. He just didn't go. So he managed to cut a deal with the organization, and they had a lot to offer him. They had their ground troops, they had their digital operations, and they had their strategists, and he didn't have any of those three. In return, as the reports came out of the meeting, he formed an Evangelical advisory council. Now, lots of presidents have been involved in public expressions of religion, and Obama had a religious advisory council that included Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Muslims, and so on. Trump's had no Catholics, no Jews, no Muslims, and not even any mainline Protestants. It was entirely fundamentalist and evangelical. And that organization also had several very influential members who were given the power to write certain parts of the Republican Party platform for the convention, especially concerning social issues. Now, if you read the press coverage, they say, all of a sudden, with their involvement, you have the most conservative Republican platform you've had in 70, 80 years. You have things referred to such as conversion therapy, which is a form of, that is regarded as mistreatment by the American Medical Association to try to force homosexuals not to be homosexuals. You had elements of trying to force the Pentagon to dismiss transsexuals simply for reason of their identity. You had a number of factors that suddenly appeared. So that was another element of the deal. Perhaps the most important element of the deal was that the organization had, the Council for National Policy included the heads of 3 organizations who are allowed to propose nominations for the federal courts. These organizations were the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, and the National Rifle Association. So they presented a list, and Trump publicly announced that he was grateful for their suggestions and he would be taking them seriously. As we know, Trump won. It's less well known that the Cruise Crew app was converted directly with the same template to the Trump app. And all of these organizations jumped in and supported him in a way that was very focused on swing states. Now here is where we get to something of a deficit on the part of the Democrats. It appears that they tended to take certain states for granted, such as the Rust Belt states. Hillary Clinton did not campaign in Wisconsin. That was a mistake. Wisconsin Democrats reported that the DNC didn't even get them campaign literature to distribute during the campaign because Wisconsin was a done deal, except it wasn't. So when the numbers came to be counted, the Democrats, who had been looking at national polls and national press, which is focused on the New York-Washington corridor, said, we've won the election with 3 million votes in the popular election, which was correct. And in that regard, the New York Times electorate meter had it right. But given the way that American democracy actually functions, the Republicans and Donald Trump won the election with 80,000 votes compared to 3 million in 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, less than 1% in each one, which was how the rules are written. And anybody who wanted to study the rules carefully would have seen it. And I must say that the strategists at the Council for National Policy studied the rules very, very carefully. So what happens then? Well, you start to see past and present members of the Council for National Policy showing up in the administration. You see them showing up in positions in the White House, such as the before-mentioned Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon. You see the Crown Princess Betsy DeVos showing up as Secretary of Education when she has no background as an educator and apparently very little commitment to the concept of public education. You have people like Ken Cuccinelli being appointed. You have Trump appointing a personal lawyer in the form of Jay Sekulow, who's another prominent member of the Council for National Policy. Now, you also have another part of the deal, which is that going into the Times Square meeting, Trump had put it about that his choice for running mate was Chris Christie. Old friend from the Northeast, made sense. Coming out of the meeting, it was Mike Pence. And not only that, when he got to putting together his transition team, he ushered Christie out and he ushered Pence into that as well. So here you have this configuration where the Council for National Policy and its members achieve a kind of prominence that they've been dreaming of for 40 years. How did they do it? Through the mechanism of Donald Trump. But everybody who is talking to me about my book say, well, but how do the evangelicals accept Trump as a figure given his issues of character? Now, I have read many, many books written by members of the Council for National Policy, so you don't have to. And some of the most interesting books describe Trump as not a man of God, but an instrument of God. And they compare him to the Persian king Cyrus. So Cyrus, for those of you who haven't gone to Sunday school for a while, was responsible for sending the Jews back to Jerusalem. So he was not Jewish himself, but he allowed God's will to be realized through his actions. And you have leaders of this movement who actually even crafted fake gold coins showing the profile of the Persian King Cyrus and Donald Trump in relief, and you can buy them on their television stations for $40 a piece, if you so choose. So really, when you get down to it, they also call Trump, quote unquote, God's wrecking ball. And you go back to these basic elements of their vision of the United States. And it's one where they see the federal government as the enemy. They see its bureaus that deal with science and regulation and education for the public, food safety, what have you, as federal intervention, unwelcome intervention on the lives of citizens. And they would argue for the abolition of entire federal agencies, starting with the EPA, including the Department of Education and others as well. So God's wrecking ball has actually been setting about doing this. You live in Washington, so you've seen more than most of us how many people have lost their positions, how many agencies have been losing their budgets, how many services for the public are not available, and how many more are threatened. And these are often not luxuries. They involve food safety, clean water, clean air, things that people depend on without even knowing it. That's part of the problem. At the same time, you see a rapid, expedited process of appointing federal judges to the circuit and appeals courts. There had been a logjam intentionally created for Obama's appointments. That left a number of openings, and these have been filled with great speed. And with a number of appointments that the American Bar Association has ruled as not qualified. The most recent one last week was for a lifetime appointment to the federal bench for a 37-year-old lawyer who had never tried a case. And the goal that is stated is to expedite these appointments and confirmations as quickly as possible and tip the courts from a previous professional, balanced state to one that is ideologically conforming to the movement that I'm describing. It is underway. It is not complete yet. I think that it would be difficult to complete within a year. I think it would definitively be completed within 5 years in a way that would transform American life, American society, and our political economy for several generations to come. When you appoint a 37-year-old to a lifetime bench appointment, you're going to get results. So that's the perspective that I lay out in the book. It has 1,000 footnotes to document what I assert. You don't have to read the footnotes, but they're there. Chicago style. And I didn't plan on writing this book. I planned on writing something that would have been more fun. But when I saw this picture starting to go together, I felt a civic obligation to describe what I was seeing. I am putting it out there. I know that some people will recognize what I write about, and some people will protest. I don't see anybody tonight, though. That's good. So that's the book I've written, and thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions. Thank you. And I guess you're supposed to go to the mics, but...
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. How does your book and your research coincide or not with the research that Jane Meyer did for Dark Money?
I think it's very complementary. And her book came out a few years ago, and it's very, very tightly focused on the Koch brothers and their business empire. And it's you know, her book is kind of the standard in reporting. I just admire it so much, and my copy is all underlined. And it's also interesting because we were in college together, and so I knew her slightly then, and then just kind of watch her mastery of this field is very satisfying. I think what my book brings to the table, one thing is that having grown up in Oklahoma and traveled back there a few times a year for decades, I think there are things about the region that only somebody connected to it would see. I mean, there's not a lot of reason that my friends in New York would be listening to these radio stations. I don't even know if they could. So I think that this split in America, you know, she's very much focused on the economic story, but I'm including a cultural story and a media story as well.
Hi, thank you. One little fact and then a question. I worked in Alaska from the beginning of its statehood, and when it became a state, it was 100% Democratic. When oil came, Texas, all the license plates were Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, all the drillers, and they brought the church with them in a very structured, organized way. And that took over the entire state. So it's a little version of what you're talking about. So the question is, given everybody in the room agrees with you, so we have two Americas, not subtly two Americas. Economically, socially, religiously, they think I'm killing babies. Right. That gives them the right to kill me in defense. Or something drastic in defense. They don't want to sit down and have a conversation about it. Baby killers. So, what's your solution? You're from Oklahoma.
Yeah, but I'm just a writer, and I really mean that I'm not. It is not my job to give policy prescriptions. There are political scientists and there are political activists whose job it is, and I seek to inform what people choose to do. I will go back to your point, though. We cannot solve this peacefully without talking to each other. We can't solve it peacefully without creating common platforms of professional journalism and communication. Now, people like Craig Newmark are starting to invest in local journalism. There are various scattered initiatives. They're not enough. They're too little, they're too late, they should be ramped up. And I also think that, you know, I talk in the book a lot about people who call Oklahoma part of the flyover, right? And sometimes if they want to be less disdainful, they call it a non-coastal area. And I heard a quote yesterday that really resonated. You can't insult people and expect them to vote for you, right? So I think that it has to come in both directions. I don't hear Democrats really trying to explain and unpack their principled position on abortion, whatever it is, much less listen to anybody else's. So if you have everybody frozen into their positions in a non-dialogue method, then there's going to be little movement. I think I also see a real decline in institutions, both local and national. I think that the mainline churches, for example, have been amazingly silent. And the fundamentalist churches have been amazingly vocal. So here are all kinds of institutions that have played an important role in American life in the past that are succumbing to the polarization rather than really deploying themselves to bring things together. Now, what is the common ground? There is some, obviously. And I think finding it and undertaking listening through the political process is our best hope.
Thank you.
How does your book align with what we see on Netflix with the miniseries The Family, or is it The Family? I forget. Or The Family, the Foundation, whatever its current name is. Where do these meet, split, come together, be apart?
Yeah, and this gentleman has been a very fine person to educate me over various stages of my career, for which I thank him. The Family and Jeff Charlotte deal with an organization also called C Street and so on. And Jeff Charlotte and I are Twitter buddies. We haven't met in person yet. And we've discussed this. They seem to intersect. It's not clear how much they overlap. It's also not clear how much they share an actual purpose. Because I think at the end, the Council for National Policy uses religious and social issues to achieve economic ends. That's my best analysis. I think the Family is much more driven by religious connections that elevate people through the political hierarchy, both in the U.S. and internationally. Jeff's work, which I also admire a great deal, is all reportorial, but he began his project by living among the family and writing about his experience. And my work and Jane's work is much more investigative in terms of combing through records. We may find that they have a close relationship. We might find that they actually don't. I would say that the Family appears to be broader in its political constituency than the Council for National Policy. The CNP, I've just never seen a kind word for a Democrat, whereas the Family and the Associated National Prayer Breakfast definitely has Democrats involved and doesn't have such a narrow policy perspective. Thank you, Don. Yes.
Well, I can't get to the microphone. I'll speak up. I have a lot of
Turn it down like the other.
perfect. There we go. Thank you. I'm a full service speaker. So I've been told. Thank you. First of all, I'm here because dear friends made a point to let me know that you would be here. And they are Fred Wade from Madison, Wisconsin, where he introduced you at their book festival.
Thank you.
And I've told other people about you. I'm curious about Mr. Pence and his relationship to radio. He used to be a radio hooker.
He
And
used to
I
be a radio
wonder-
host, talk show
yeah,
host, yeah.
So I wonder if you happen to know
With
whether or not he is still involved in the radio in any way. Does he own the station? Does he participate? Does he,
I don't believe he ever owned the station, but he had kind of a failed first stage of his political career, and then radio was someplace where he went back and honed some of his skills. And it's my belief that that was the point 20 years ago where he first converged with major figures from the Council for National Policy. Now, in terms of who he is, I recommend my friend Tom Lobianco's book, Power and Piety, which is a biography of Mike Pence. And he finds the moment in 2008 where the true support happened. But Tom and I have had this conversation because I said to him, when was this moment on Mike Pence's radio show where he hosted one of the CNP leaders? And he said, I went to the archives of the radio station where he worked, and they were all gone. Now, most radio stations maintain their tapes for years, and he said that nobody would talk about where the tapes went. Nobody knew. And of course, my first thought at that is, what do they have to hide? So that's one of the interesting factoids about Mike Pence's radio career.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So my question is, if the Republican Party has effectively been subsumed by a death cult, why do you personally think it is that so much of the Democratic Party establishment is so committed to compromising with them? My question is because we saw during the 2016 campaign that Clinton's people made it a real, well, it seemed to them their understanding was they could reach out to turned off, disgusted Republican voters and try to bring them onto their side. And that strategy, I think, was an admirable one. It was one I guess they believed in, and it didn't seem to work out that time. I would assume that they'd think of it, see it as a failed experiment and try something different next time, but it seems to me that in this most recent election, you're seeing a similar thing from some quarters of people saying, oh, we need to find someone who will satisfy both parties, we need someone who won't alienate people, when just the whole national tide feels like it's shifting in the opposite direction.
Okay. I don't find death cult a term of art. But I'll work on this. So I kind of went into this project with this fuzzy thinking about American democracy and the people vote and then you elect someone. And this research really corrected my thinking. So as well, it was just factually, the 2020 election will effectively, at least if you look at the research of an expert like Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia, will be decided by about 100,000 people, many of them over 65 because they turn out in greater numbers than people from younger demographics, from probably 4 of 6 swing states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. 4 of those will pretty much define the future of the country and in many ways the future of the planet, right? So as you have the Democrats debating the bars of virtue and which candidate represents, many times I feel they're not really looking at the mathematics. You're going to win the election in November or you're going to lose the election in November. And virtue may not define the results. If you look at the strategists of the Council for National Policy 20, 30 years ago, they're already saying God does not need a majority. They're saying you don't have to worry about being right to win. And in fact, they criticized the Coldwater campaign. They said Barry Goldwater said, in your heart, you know he's right. They said that was a mistake. You don't have to be right. You just have to win. So that's where this incredible strategic capacity comes in. And think about it, like where the Democrats stayed home because they didn't like their candidate, the Republicans got a candidate that many of them hated, who came to the position through means of celebrity and his whole television career, which was breaking all the rules. And they still turned on a dime and got behind him and pushed him into office. So they basically are positing the question, do you want to feel virtuous or do you want to win?
Hello. So I got a couple things from your speech about the book. One is that Trump is basically a servant of this organization, and I guess I was just wondering what your opinion is on how much Trump is simply taking what this organization is telling him and feeding him as a faithful instrument versus something like what a Ted Cruz would have done. I mean, it almost seems like, from your perspective, and I was hoping you could clarify that, in fact, Trump is being is a better outcome than if Ted Cruz was in office. So I was just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for them, Trump is a servant in the same way that if you hired a butler who was also a 2-year-old having a tantrum, right? Because he keeps breaking all the china, right? He's not controllable. And he keeps showing that. And actually, what I'm hearing from word around town, and I just published a piece in Salon about this last week, is that Pence was always their plan B, their guy in reserve. And I think they went into it and gradually became pleased with which of their goals they were able to accomplish through Trump, largely through things that Trump didn't care about. You know, he was just, it was transactional. As time goes on and you have incidents like his behavior with the Kurds, with the problems over the Ukrainian call, they're just all of these uncontrollable headaches. But then it puts them, from what I can tell, in this very uncomfortable position at the roulette table. Because if they do go along with the dump Trump motion and allow impeachment to proceed without obstructing it, with the plan of Pence as plan B, that's a very dangerous proposition filled with risks and perils. So all I can say is that we're going into a period of the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times.
So I thought the presentation was wonderful. And my question is, the Republicans and the CNP seem to be quite effective politically to win with a minority of the total vote. For the future elections in 2020 and also what happened in 2018, do you see the Democratic side or any organizations supporting the Democrats taking the lessons that your story tells and developing a strategy that's going to make them more effective? Certainly the Democratic candidates who are appearing now, I don't think are causing tremendous enthusiasm among a lot of Democrats.
But back to the previous point, you had a Republican field full of never Trumpers. We're not talking about diminished enthusiasm. We're talking about antagonism. So if the Democrats are going to wait for perfection, they're going to wait a long time. In terms of my book's impact, it was published yesterday, so I haven't seen it yet. I know things are going on behind the scenes. I hear glimmerings of them. I assume with very good reason to believe that both sides are stepping up their game. You're going to see a record amount of money spent in the next year. You're going to see people mobilized and engaged on both sides in ways you haven't seen before. Because really, 2020, November 2020, is a very decisive moment. And I don't think this is exaggerating. I think in the history of the world, of the modern world, and you think especially about environment and climate, one direction is to close down all recognition and scientific understanding of environment and climate issues. The other side, all of the Democratic candidates seem to recognize that it's a problem and are committed to doing something and support the mechanisms that exist in terms of the federal government, academia, science, and other international institutions. That is a big dividing line. And we're dealing with an electorate where not everyone is equally informed and is equally cognizant of the issues. So a lot will be done over the next year, and I will be watching with great interest. Yeah.
Thank you. I found your talk very interesting, and having worked in the state level in South Carolina for a long time before I came to Washington, very resonant with the transformation in the Democratic South to the Republican South and the takeover of the media that you refer to. One of the things that I'm curious about is whether or not the Council has an agenda internationally, whether or not, for example, with respect to the Middle East, there is an end game.
Well, it certainly has an international agenda, and I kept seeing aspects of it, but I had to keep the book under control to finish it. But one thing that we've seen very recently is the Canadian elections. And just as the gentleman was talking about the oil interests in Alaska, the same thing has happened in the Canadian province of Alberta, which is the origin of some of the Koch pipeline activities. And you've had parties that have emerged that actually use the same data platform and the same app templates and the same mechanism of door-to-door campaigning on the issue of abortion in Canada, pushing that agenda and trying to defeat Trudeau. As I said, the app was also used for the Brexit campaign in the UK, and it is also used for conservative movements in Australia, I have just learned, and some of the new right-wing parties in Europe. I've also been talking to colleagues who are researching their work in Latin America. There's an organization, or a movement rather, in Latin America called Con mis hijos no te metas, don't mess with our kids, which claims that the entire continent is being ravaged by homosexual teachers assaulting children in schools, which is not true. And it has resulted in violence against the LGBT populations in Latin America, and there are direct connections to this movement from that. And it's orchestrated. If you look at the signs and the protests in countries, whether it's Brazil or Colombia or Peru, where I first saw it in action, the typeface on the signs in the protests and the design is identical from a common source. And in general, there's a very, very strong commitment to using and fomenting hostility towards LGBT populations as a political instrument, which I think is wrong. Another aspect of this is in the Middle East. You have a lot of pressure to promote a policy towards Israel that is consonant with a fundamentalist vision of the land. And my book quotes our Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, at a religious service talking about the rapture. So that as an element of foreign policy is something we've not considered recently.
All right, we have time for this one last question.
Hi. I actually have two questions, or whatever, topics. One of which is with regard to, because it was someone here brought it up, what's the source, what's driving this fundamentalism, et cetera, right? What's the source of that? And I've done a lot of research myself, and I've done a lot of reading, and I would encourage everyone to read 2 books and then go on YouTube and do a search. So one book is called Alpha God, and the author is, Herman Garcia, I believe, is the name. It's worth reading, and it explains a lot as far as this alpha male business, right? Mm. And he goes deeply into religion, the religious sources of this, right? It's worth a read because it answers a lot of the why questions. With regard to another source of that, Spencer Wells, who was famous at National Geographic, was a decade or more ago with the DNA around the world, following the DNA, et cetera, right? He wrote a book called Pandora's Seed, which traces, this is not his intent, but there's a lot of information that goes back 5,000 to 10,000 years in the beginning of civilization, to the beginning of domestication, et cetera, which basically is an alpha male type of a mentality. It's so ingrained in our culture as a civilization that's started with domestication and property ownership and all of that. Those are 2 really good reads as far as some semblance, of background of the why, right? Another source is, well, it's kind of more of a comment, and then actually both of mine are kind of comments. Yeah, so I'm just going to recommend that. And then another one is Robert Sapolsky, who's done a lot of research, and you can find him on, if you do Robert Sapolsky and with the baboon study in Africa, and there was an accidental experiment with a troop of baboons where all of the alpha males died. They got tuberculosis and they died. So the troop of baboons, which is always an alpha male-driven society of baboons, became non-alpha male. So the culture changed, and the whole society of that troop changed, and it's stuck, right? Which gives me hope, because that means that we might be able to get away from this if we are able to, change our culture. So, so the pushback, of, the people like Reverend Barber and, and mainline religions and that.
We have books for sale up behind the cash registers. We'll form a signing line down the side of the store.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.